All right, it's 2 past, I think. And Nadia, should we get going? Great. Well, welcome back to February's Research Forum. It's nice to sort of pick up where we left off. Last year was a busy year for fellows, and it was so busy, in fact, that this year the Research Forum is taking on a slightly different sort of shape. Instead of having 2 fellows, we're going to have 3 fellows for each of these forums. As before, they'll all speak for about 20 minutes. If you could hold your questions to the end, just so we can make sure that everybody has their allocated time, there'll be a time for us to regroup and talk with them specifically about the things that they raised. Um, so, just briefly, we have 3 fellows today, as I said. We have Catherine Stiefel, Samuel New, and we have Emily Wells. All of these 3 fellows were supported by the Watson Brown Foundation's underwriting of the Southern Studies grants here today, here at Wilson. 2 of them are in their dissertation phase, and they were doing dissertation research. And Sam was here really trying to establish, what his project was going to be, what the resources looked like. So he was still working on his perspectives. So the first person to speak today will be Emily Wells. Emily's from William and Mary, and the title of her presentation, as you probably all know, is Keep Within the Compass, Geography and Girlhood in the American South, 1783 to 1865. Welcome, Emily. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Okay. Okie doke. So thank you for that introduction. So as Matt said, my name is Emily. I'm from William and Mary, and I'm working on a dissertation about girlhood and place in the American South during the early national and antebellum periods. So when people think about Southern girlhood, often the first image that comes to mind is Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. And this ideal of female adolescence is really ingrained in our nation's collective memory of the antebellum South. But it's not really an accurate representation of Southern girlhood. And the Southern belle, as we know her today, is really a cultural ideal based in sectionalism and lost cause ideology. But Scarlett wasn't the first girl to embody a sentimental and romanticized ideal of white girlhood. Before her, there was Eva St. Clair from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And before Eva, there was Emily Binney, a girl whose grave served as a monument to the sentimental ideal of white girlhood. And when Tristram Lothar Skinner visited Emily's grave in 1842, he was struck by its sentimental quality, and he noted the air of innocence and purity that it inspired. So the purpose of my dissertation is to look beyond these ideals and to examine how elite white girls thought about themselves and their place in the world. And specifically, I'm interested in how girls used place as a tool for the production of social identity. And sometimes these places were physical environments that they inhabited, like their homes or their schools, but sometimes they were places that they had only read about in books or newspapers. And scholars, especially geographers, have argued for decades over the exact definition of place, and there really is no one definitive definition. But I view place as an environment that is already laden with structure and meaning, but which can be continually remade and reinterpreted. So, for example, when you walk into a house, you might decide to remake it by tearing down a wall, or change how you engage with the barriers that you encounter. And conversely, the structures and meaning already invested in the house might influence how you interact with other inhabitants. So essentially, we make place and place makes us. And each chapter of my dissertation focuses on a different type of place: domestic, narrative, political, and memorial. And today I'm just going to go through and highlight some particularly interesting materials that I came across at the Wilson and talk about how these documents relate to these 4 geographies. And just a note throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the words place, space, and geography somewhat interchangeably. They have slightly different meanings, but I'm not going to subject y'all to that. So to begin, I want to look at what I call domestic geographies. In this chapter, I seek to understand how girls navigated both the physical space of their home and the social space of their household. And when I was at the Wilson, I spent a lot of time going through the Cameron family papers. And this manuscript, titled Advice from My Father, is one of my favorites from that collection. And I suspect that Francis Nash, a brigadier general in the Continental Army, is the father referenced in the title, and that one of his daughters transcribed his advice at a later date, although I'm not entirely certain. This was in a miscellaneous folder. There wasn't a lot of accompanying material. The author begins by advising his daughter on how she should move through domestic space. He writes that when she enters a room after getting up in the morning, she is to hold up her head, put on a pleasing countenance, and in the most graceful manner, present herself by making a low curtsy. The author also specifies that this girl must not scrape her heels on the floor, but on the contrary, walk so as scarcely to be heard. And once seated, she must never sit carelessly in her chair. And I thought this document was a great piece of unpublished conduct literature that provides insight into how some parents expected their daughters to move through domestic space. And this author emphasizes that girls should really be acutely aware of how they position themselves within this space, with the implicit assumption that others are observing their movements. But of course, the desires of adults come into conflict with those of children. So also in the Cameron family papers are a series of letters pertaining to the upbringing and education of Mary Ann Cameron. And these letters are an excellent case study in how conflicts between adults and children play out within domestic space. So like many elite white girls, Mary Ann's extensive familial network allowed her to expand the domestic sphere beyond her parental home. At the age of 8, she began to pay extended visits to her aunt, Jean Cameron Syme. And there she came into conflict with adult family members who disapproved of her deportment and attempted to redirect her attention and physical movement. In one of her letters, Jean noted that Mary Ann frequently had squabbles with her uncle due to her inattention and lamented that she was industrious in collecting freckles. And Jean believed that Mary Ann would grow out of her restlessness, but saw no solution to the latter issue unless she was to be wholly confined to the house. And Mary Ann's supposed inattention and desire to run about outside collecting freckles contrasts really strongly with the restraint and self-awareness demonstrated by the ideal daughter described in Advice from My Father. At the age of 10, Mary Ann entered the Warrenton Female Seminary, where she continued to fall short of adult expectations. And I consider boarding schools like Warrenton to be domestic spaces, largely because proprietors almost always use domesticity as one of their selling points. In this advertisement for Warrenton, Jacob Mordecai states that the domestic arrangement for an efficient accommodation of my scholars will be an object of primary concern and placed under the immediate inspection of Mrs. Mordecai, believing it to be no small part of the education bestowed on females to cultivate a taste for neatness in their persons and propriety of manners. And unfortunately for Mary Ann, the Mordecais were very serious in their commitment to domestic education. And in almost every report sent back from Warrenton, Mary Ann's instructors complained of her inattention and lack of neatness. And at one point, she received a reprimand for putting the keys putting out of place the keys of a dozen trunks, which may have raised concern regarding her ability to protect domestic property. Towards the end of her time at Warrenton, Mary Ann wrote a note insulting one of her instructors during class. And in response, Rachel Mordecai urged Mary Ann's mother to correct her behavior. She wrote that while Mary Ann's errors might be imputed to childishness, she is now too nearly grown to be continually guilty of the same faults without more strenuous measures taken for their correction. So as Mary Ann grew older, adults expected her to take on more responsibility. Rather than running about outside collecting freckles, adults expected her to internalize the social and physical boundaries of domestic space. And while Mary Ann struggled to internalize these boundaries, other girls spun romantic visions of domestic futures. This love token was likely given to James Monroe Spencer by his future wife, Cornelia Phillips, at some point prior to their marriage in 1855. It's made from a piece of perforated paper, which is embroidered with wool thread and attached to a piece of silk ribbon, and it would have most likely been used as a bookmark. And the cottage was a common trope used to convey domestic comfort and familial love at this time. And the materiality of this object echoes the embroidered sentiment. It's private, it's meant to be hidden between the pages of a book rather than displayed openly for all to see. And by giving this token to the man she would later marry, Cornelia was able to communicate her feelings for him as well as her dreams for future domestic happiness. But of course, Southern girls understood that their access and authority within domestic spaces was heavily dependent on the coercion of enslaved laborers. In this letter, a student at the Macon Female Institute in Tennessee writes of the plight of another student, Betty Norman, who was going to leave school because the enslaved people who were hired to defray her school expenses had self-emancipated. Betty's presence at the Macon Female Institute was literally dependent on slavery. By losing access to the institute, she lost access to a space in which she would learn the trappings of genteel domesticity. Girls who did have access to enslaved labor used spatial dynamics to convey their racial privilege and social authority within the home. While perusing the Jones family papers, genealogical research led me to an interview given by a woman who was formerly enslaved by the family as part of the WPA interview program in the 20th century. So as a girl, Betty Coger served as a maid to Ella Jones, who was the daughter of Beverly and Julia Conrad Jones. And in her interview, Betty describes how Ella claimed her when she was an infant and Ella was just a young girl. Ella and Betty's spatial interactions reflected this unequal power dynamic. Betty not only slept on Ella's bedroom floor, but also stood behind her chair at dinner. Ella also assigned Betty household tasks, such as keeping her fire going while she was out in town. And when Betty failed to do so one day, she inadvertently undermined Ella's domestic authority. And in response, Ella told Betty that while she had never hit her in the past, she sure felt like doing it then. So as all of these documents show, girls had complicated relationships with domestic space. Some failed to conform to social and spatial boundaries like Mary Ann, while others used these boundaries to assert their own authority. And still others like Cornelia romanticized domestic space and used it to imagine an unknown future. But not all geographies consist of physical spaces that girls engaged with on a daily basis. In my chapter on narrative geographies, I look at how girls thought about place through the lens of published fiction. In the John Steele papers, I found a letter that spoke to the way girls engaged with narrative, which is important for understanding their relationship to narrative space. In 1802, Anne Nesfield Steele informed her sister that she and a friend had spent the entire morning play acting as Evelina and Camilla, the titular characters of novels written by Frances Burney. And when placed in conversation with other girlhood manuscripts, Anne's letter provides insight into a type of narrative engagement grounded in play acting that evolved over the course of the late 18th and 19th centuries. And though Anne and her friend only engaged within this form of play acting for a few hours, other girls elaborated upon this practice by constructing narrative landscapes in which they could imagine themselves as heroines. I also look at how girls thought about themselves in relation to broader political geographies. This receipt is another one of my favorite documents from my time at the Wilson. And it shows goods purchased by Miss Steele, likely Anne Steele. And it provides insight into one of the ways girls situated themselves within political, specifically imperial geographies. So it shows that Anne purchased a number of clothing items from a woman named Mary Sullivan in 1801. And I want to draw your attention to the third and fourth lines on this receipt, which show that she purchased an Egyptian dress and a Turkish crepe dress. So the Turkish crepe dress likely refers to a robe a la Turk, the style of which varied during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but generally consisted of an open robe with short sleeves, such as the one pictured here. And while the robe a la Turk was well established by 1801, the Egyptian dress was something new. That same year, the French ended a 3-year military campaign in Egypt and Syria, and this campaign piqued public interest in Egyptian aesthetics, as reflected in the two dresses shown here. So, like the Turkish dress, European and American interpretations of Egyptian dress were not standardized. The center image shows an Egyptian dress, which consists of a length of yellow fabric that is draped across a base garment. And on the right, we see a tunique a la Mamluk, a garment named after the elite warrior class that ruled over Egypt at the time of the campaign. So through both her Turkish and Egyptian dresses, Anne engaged with styles that had been appropriated and filtered through an imperial lens. And while not accurate to the place that they referenced, these styles indicated that the wearer was invested in these imperial networks. So another way that girls engaged with political geographies was, of course, through their formal geography lessons. Geography was an essential component of genteel female education, first gaining popularity in Europe and America during the late 18th century. This copybook was kept by Rebecca Cameron, the sister of Mary Ann, who I discussed earlier. And in this copybook, Rebecca wrote down questions and answers taken from a textbook. And the choices that she or perhaps her instructor made regarding what passages to record demonstrate how geography lessons often served as vehicles for political instruction. So in her copybook, Rebecca used geographical determinism to uphold racial hierarchies, highlighted the productive potential of the North American landscape, and celebrated the exploits of European colonizers. On the page displayed here, kind of 3/4 down the page, she states that the most barbarous quarter of the world is Africa. So that's just kind of a taste for the rest of the book. And when read alongside the textbook that Rebecca most likely used as a source, it becomes clear that she or her instructor deliberately selected passages that supported an economic and moral system rooted in white supremacy, enslavement, and dispossession. So later in her copybook, Rebecca copies a passage on the cultivation of rice. And she copies this passage verbatim from Daniel Adams' Geography. But she stops just before his graphic critique of the conditions endured by enslaved laborers. The section highlighted here shows the lines that she included in her copybook, and this section focuses entirely on the type of land required for the cultivation of rice, with no mention of labor. And the section she excluded is entirely focused on labor and reads as a humanitarian critique of slavery. While Rebecca's exclusion of Adams' critique seems deliberate, it's possible that she engaged with an abridged manuscript provided by her instructor. But regardless, the selective inclusion of this and other textbook passages shows how geographical and political instruction were deeply intertwined. And so the final chapter of my dissertation pulls back from the experiences of girls who lived during the early national and antebellum periods and looks instead at how Southerners used girls and the concept of girlhood as an avenue through which they could reconstruct and neutralize Southern landscapes. And in this chapter, I especially look at memoirs written by Southern women who were girls at the time of the Civil War to see how they describe the places that define their memories of the Old South. And most women wrote these memoirs at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. But there was a document that I found on my last day at the Wilson that indicated that this memory work began even sooner than I had thought. So this document was a typescript from the Young Ladies column for September 24th, 1873. And in this column, Cornelia Phillips Spencer charged young women to preserve documents and objects related to the Confederacy. And as a side note, that Cornelia, this is the same woman who made the bookmark from earlier. So Spencer rooted her call for preservation in fear, specifically fear of a changing social landscape. If all things social and political had remained quiet at the close of the war, she wrote, people might have preserved their letters, papers, and personal relics and reminders of the 4 years' fight. However, the revolution, which has steadily been progressing since 1865, has left but few facilities and but little inclination for the preservation of such memorabilia. As a result, many white Southerners had found it necessary to dispose of their household goods as best they might, shake off the ties and associations of a life, and in new and distant homes begin life anew. Girls, Spencer argued, had the power to reconstitute these social geographies and memorialize the Confederate South through preservation. She also urged them to submit war narratives to a weekly paper entitled Our Living and Our Dead, dedicated to the war record of North Carolina. What were the circumstances, incidents, and experiences of your neighborhood, she asked. Make an attempt and write something down that may be worth preserving. So Spencer's column shows that from a very early point during the post-war period, girls were encouraged to play an active role in preserving Southern memory and reconstituting Southern geographies. So thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who helped me while I was at the Wilson.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was really wonderful. I look forward to the questions that we had afterwards. So our next speaker today is, so I just want to make sure I get the run of show right, is Catherine Stiefel, and she's going to be talking about Semblance of Freedom, the resilience and resistance of virtual slaves in the Southern legal regime. Welcome, Catherine, and thank you for speaking with us today. Oh, you're actually on mute, I think.
Of course. Thank you, Matt. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the Wilson Library for its generous support. It's been a pleasure working with all of the library staff and who provided me with direction and paved the way for me to complete my research in the Wilson Archives. Focused on North Carolina and the South broadly, my dissertation project investigates the phenomenon of virtual slaves' interaction with the law. The American common law system encouraged and maintained institutional slavery from the colonial era until it ended in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Enslaved people have historically been characterized as living in a binary state, either free or slave. However, this portrayal ignores the quandary of virtual slaves who existed in an ambiguous netherworld between slavery and freedom. Variously referred to in the antebellum era as quasi-free or semi-emancipated or virtually free, these people lived under the loose supervision of an enslaver or a trustee and often worked illegally for their own benefit. As one segment of this multifaceted racial hierarchy, these people neither fully slave or free, and their intersection with the law remains understudied. My dissertation project intends to close this gap by examining manumission cases by will and trust, deeds of emancipation, freedom petitions, and self-hiring enslaved hiring practices that created this third category of slavery and slave, that is qualified freedom and virtual slaves. Probing the early Republic and antebellum legal confrontation over these enslaved people living in this liminal space enhances historians' understanding of, as historian Lauren Sweninger puts it, the dynamic nature of the South's peculiar institution and its evolution. My research at the Wilson focused on completing 2 chapters of my dissertation. The first of these chapters examines moderate white, moderate, or anti-slavery intermediaries who provided virtual slaves access to legal remedies that they were unable to access themselves. Through the lens of testamentary manumission cases that created virtual slaves, this chapter explores the moral and legal ambiguity lawyers and judges faced when arguing and judging these cases. That is, how would they resolve the conflict between their moral objection to slavery and their obligation to keep the law and do their job? The Wilson's extensive archives of North Carolina lawyers and judges' personal correspondence and records enabled me to read their thoughts and motives directly as they litigated these cases. Particularly important were the papers of William Gadsden, lawyers John H. and James W. Bryan, lawyer and judge Thomas Ruffin, and lawyers George Badger and George Mendenhall. To use Gadsden as an example, I got a real sense of the man from his early writings to young lawyers that he was training in his office. Letters to his wife and daughter also provided me an in-depth look at their relationships and their everyday experiences as enslaver and judge. His speech to the graduates at UNC, letters regarding cases, and his opinion helped me chart the ambiguity and moral struggle he faced over how to live with institutional slavery, but not fully support it. The Bryan papers too were important, and they handled a lot of virtual slave cases, and they provided a day-to-day view of virtual slaves in court. Work in the Ruffin papers was particularly important because it helped me articulate his approach to a decade-long series of cases he judged against a Quaker, John Newland, who held enslaved people bequeathed to him in a state of qualified bondage until he took them to Ohio 10 years later and emancipated them. The second chapter that I worked on at the Wilson considered virtual slaves' direct interaction with the law and how that interaction undermined institutional slavery. In this case, or here, I researched petitions to the courts, the legislature, and I looked at hire and self-hire enslaved practices, and suits by virtual slaves for freedom and for their support. In regard to how hiring out and self-hiring practices created virtual slaves and how this practice undermined the tenets of slavery, the Pettigrew family papers and the Hayes collection were key. These collections gave me an opportunity to actually hear the voices of enslaved Black overseers who, as virtual slaves, were in complete charge of the farms of their enslavers and regularly corresponded with them. The letters that these virtual slaves wrote demonstrated their agricultural skills, their industry, and ultimately, as the Civil War approached, their urgency to escape the constraints of institutional slavery. The correspondence between the patriarchs of these two families, William S. Pettigrew and James Cathcart Johnston, revealed their attitudes and perspectives on institutional slavery. I appreciated that in both collections, the finding aids provided detailed biographical information and that the locations of the letters from the enslaved overseers were noted in the finding aids of the Johnston collection. That's in the Hayes. The quick and efficient responses to my request for scanned copies of undigitized folders from the Hayes collection was also very important and very helpful. The research on this chapter was also aided by the voices of the enslaved in Wilson's special collection that Sarah Carrier put me onto and had put together. I will use the writings highlighted in this collection of virtual slave George Moses Horton, who wrote poems and sold them at Chapel Hill. And he also wrote poems for the Pettigrews, as well as poems protesting his slavery in an upcoming chapter and my final chapter. I only have one left. These poems demonstrated the means virtual slaves used to resist a smothering legal culture. It's really remarkable to have access to actual examples of enslaved people's voices was key to completing that chapter. These resources demonstrated that there was room for virtual slaves to tempt freedom and that they took every advantage and every opportunity of doing so. I've now completed both drafts of those chapters, and thanks in large part to the Wilson Library's resources and the helpful assistance from the staff. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Our final discussant today is Samuel Niu, who's going to be talking about the other Chinese question, immigration, race, and the problem of labor in the age of emancipation. Sam, welcome. Delighted to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you. So as Matt said earlier, I was doing as pre-prospectus, and I still am, so I don't have like chapters or anything. So it's a little bit more amorphous than Catherine's and Emily's, but so I studied the 19th century United States with a focus on emancipation, immigration, and labor, especially in the South. And my project kind of revolves around what I identify as like two major problems or two major questions that confronted especially Southern planters, but also like plantation managers, commission merchants, Northern financiers, entrepreneurs, labor agents, and I'm looking for the evidence, but I imagine also laborers themselves, whether they're newly emancipated or immigrant or otherwise. And so those two questions, the first is the problem of labor, which I think is probably somewhat more familiar to historians of the South during Emancipation and Reconstruction. So that problem basically for planters was, what to do now, how to grow cash crops, how to generate wealth, how to, as they sought to renew the South and return themselves to their former positions of wealth and power. Now that their primary labor force, enslaved people had been emancipated, and they were no longer compelled to work as slaves, man, woman, and child, morning, noon, and night. And so what planters perceived this as was a labor shortage, and that's like part and parcel of what I and other people have called the labor problem. And then the second question that kind of like frames my project is one that kind of tries to answer that labor problem and solve it. And it's, I think, maybe less familiar in Southern US history and more on the West Coast. But it asks, can Chinese immigrant labor solve the Southern labor problem? And I call this like the other Chinese question, just to distinguish it from the one going on in California on the West Coast, Australia, South Africa, and all within the same general a couple of decades. And so the hope for my project then is to kind of explore the interplay between these two questions and the people that the questions concern. So what was the depth and extent of this Chinese question or this other Chinese question? Who was asking it? Why were they asking it? How are they answering it? To what extent were the Southern elites who were asking this question looking across the Gulf to the Atlantic, to the British West Indies, across the continent to California, over to Hawaii, Australia, South Africa, anywhere where Chinese immigrant labor or contract labor, indentured labor was already rooted and established. And so that's kind of like one set of questions. And then another set of questions I'm interested in exploring is kind of like about the Chinese themselves. So who were they? What were their experiences? What were their relationships with freed people, white laborers, immigrant laborers, and so on. And so I guess like the larger, like the so what, the significance of it, I also see as two pronged. So on the one hand, you have like the human story, like the intimate human story, the value of just detailing or recovering and sharing stories of the human experience. That being like the experience of the Chinese immigrants, which I don't think is untold so much as is somewhat undertold maybe. And then from like a more like political economy angle, I ask, so like what is this episode in US history, this 10-year period, like the 1870s roughly, the narrow optic of Chinese labor and the attempt to import Chinese labor to replace free people's labor, and ultimately the failure of that experiment. What does this tell us about the nature of freedom in the South, the nature of emancipation, and their relationship with labor rights and immigration during this period of Reconstruction? So those are the very large questions that I need to pare down ultimately, but those are the questions that I came to UNC in the summer with. And as I was, pre-prospectus, I was doing pretty much what I'm going to borrow Matt's words, which were a fact-finding mission, which is just a good way of describing where I was kind of not really sure what I was looking for or where to find it. And so largely I was just trying to figure out, okay, what's out there? What collection could I possibly use? What even exists that I can get my hands on? And so I kind of identified a number of collections that I thought might be possibly relevant to my project, or what I thought and still think my project might be about, and also figure out how to navigate an archive, how to take notes, like all the very basic stuff, because this was my first time doing research in an archive, and hopefully using whatever I did find, and this is what I do plan to use with what I found, to give greater context and greater texture to like what was going on in the South. So what was going on around the people, like the main actors in this story of Chinese immigration during the Reconstruction period. So I'll divide my time like probably unevenly between, on the one hand, talking about what I found and the collections I used and how I might use that material. And then the second part being more like my experience researching in general. Like, as I said, this was my first time in the archive, so I thought it might be worth talking about, hopefully, just like the general experience. So the George Gift papers were probably the most like directly relevant, explicitly relevant to my project. And so George Gift was a labor broker who in 1869 traveled from the United States over to Hong Kong on behalf of planters to procure Chinese workers, Chinese immigrant laborers, and then bring them back to the US South. And so in a number of his letters that he writes back to his wife, he describes like all the different struggles he encountered while he was doing this. So whether it be, in gathering Chinese workers, trying to convince them to come with him, or navigating what essentially was like a labyrinth of different British, Chinese, and American migration and labor laws, whether who was allowed to leave, who's allowed to come into the United States, whether allowed to come into the United States as contract laborers, whether that designates them as indentured labor, or are they entering as free, all these kinds of things that George Gift was like, I don't know, I'm just trying to get these people over, I'm trying to fulfill my contract. And then also like on the more human level, just being away from his wife and his children for a very long time. And you can see that popping up in the letters quite frequently. And so even though George Gift's letters describing his time in Hong Kong or his trip to Hong Kong are only like a pretty small part of that collection, they're still like extremely valuable to my project, I think, because they will allow me to see how international labor brokers actually conceived of their projects, of their operations abroad, how they actually executed those operations, how they saw Chinese people, how they saw Asia, and how they conveyed this all back to the South as people were going in this little frenzy over Chinese labor. And I think it's all part of the same cycle. And to actually see someone doing it and see their kind of like not live, but almost live reactions to what was going on is pretty valuable. So that's the George Gift papers. And then another collection that I used that was also quite relevant to my work was the Humas Plantation and William Porter Miles material collection. And so this is, again, just giving more of the story of post-emancipation Chinese immigrant plantation labor. And it focuses on John Burnside, who was this like extremely wealthy planter, pretty famous, one of the largest slave owners prior to the Civil War. And what was interesting about him, besides the fact that he was one of the largest slave owners, is that he was also an immigrant from Belfast, Ireland. And he managed to like maintain his wealth and grow his commission merchant firm and expand the number of plantations he owned and operated in Louisiana even after the war. So by the 1870s, he owned Humas Plantation, Armand Plantation, and a number of others, while also being intimately involved in the management and the finances of many, many more through his commission merchant firm. So in the 1870s, he signed a contract with Chinese laborers to work on his Armand Plantation. And one of those contracts was in the collection. So it was extremely valuable for me to like see the contract and read it, both to get the actual like particulars of what the actual agreements were, what were the arrangements, and also because it was signed by one of the Chinese laborers as like a headman, as a representative. And so once I can figure out what that character is, I can try tracing them through immigration census records. Although the character is very hard, that I couldn't figure out what it was. So I figured I'd put it to the side and then come back to it later. So Burnside's papers in this collection, beyond just the actual contract, which is pretty neat to actually be able to find. Also his writings, his letters, as a commission merchant, as someone who's deeply invested in plantation labor in the post-emancipation South, they reflect like the labor conditions of sugar plantations outside of just Chinese labor. So again, adding valuable context and demonstrate not only how some planters survived emancipation, but actually thrived in its wake, and how they did so. So Burnside, for instance, used his status as a British subject to recuperate ownership of his plantation after Union forces seized it during the Civil War. And I think this just highlights how inseparable the story of immigration is from that of emancipation and Reconstruction, while also highlighting, the inconsistencies or the unevenness in the experience of immigration, clearly, because you have Burnside on one hand and Chinese laborers on the other hand, who, struggling to find the name, one of the wealthiest people in Louisiana. So beyond those two, there were a number of other collections that I used that, again, were to provide useful insight into the politics and the labor arrangements of the South during Reconstruction, as I said, to add texture and context to what was going on around. And that would be like the Polk, Ewell and Brown papers, the T. Butler King papers, and the Henry Clay Warmoth papers were all extremely helpful in that regard. And those were all collections that I had identified before getting to UNC as potential sources of letters and other documents that would be useful to me. But the Cheng and Eng Bunker papers were a collection that I hadn't put in my initial research plans, and it was really more that I saw it in the like the exhibit room. I forget the name of it, but where they had all the exhibits, and after seeing them there, I ended up going through their papers. So that was kind of like an unexpected foray into the history and the lives of these two people. They're famously like the Siamese twins, the conjoined brothers, Cheng and Eng Bunker, which led me to watching The Greatest Showman, which is unrelated, but ultimately allowed me a chance to like think about Chinese immigration in the 19th century South from an angle other than plantation labor. So they are Siamese nationals of Chinese descent. And they were among the earliest Chinese immigrants in the South, right? So they settled in North Carolina years before emancipation. And they eventually rose to be extremely wealthy through their performances, and later ended up owning slaves themselves. And I think just their lives as examples of just Chinese people in the South, it would be an interesting starting point for my study of Chinese immigrants and emancipation in the South, just again to show the complexity and the unevenness of the experience, right? To kind of shatter the idea of, oh, there was a single experience or a monolith of Chinese immigrants in the South, even though they were such a small number of people. And so, I'm probably not going to expand my study much beyond plantation labor, but I do think Cheng and Eng Bunker are useful and compelling counterparts to the laborers that I am focusing on. And I need to think more about exactly how I'm going to fit them into my study, but I'm pretty sure their lives are going to play some part in this history. So those are like the main findings I had with the material, or the main highlights. And so to turn to my experience more on my experience of researching, of being in the archive, I think I was struck especially by like how incredibly efficient and organized everything was, especially with the material on the cart. So we like had our own like personal queue. But even when I would finish a box or like finish with everything on the card, it would be like almost in no time at all. Someone would come and reshelve it and bring out more boxes. And I remember before I left to go do the research, everyone was like, oh yeah, be prepared to sit for like 20 or 30 minutes as people like find the boxes. But I was like, nope, I don't think I waited for more than like 2 minutes or 3 minutes to get a box. So I just wanted to, I thought that was extremely impressive. So I just wanted to thank everyone at the library who helped make it so smooth and so efficient. And then with regards to like actually reading through the material, I think I discovered probably my favorite thing in an archive is reading stuff that isn't like really necessarily directly relevant to my own work. So stuff that, as I said, like, yeah, it might provide context, it might provide texture, but it's also kind of fun just to read stuff and be like, I don't think I'm going to use this, but it's pretty interesting. And just to use these papers as like an intimate window into people's lives, which, yeah, it feels a little bit invasive and like a little bit gossipy sometimes, but it's part of the fun, I think. So for example, like this is actually still relevant to my project, but besides chronicling his experience going to Hong Kong and trying to get Chinese labor, George Gift's letters also reflect just like a human experience of being away from someone that you love and trying to communicate with them over a long distance. Because I ended up reading his papers back through during the Civil War, immediately after, and so before he went to Hong Kong. And it was just, like I said, felt a little bit invasive, but also you could see him and his wife kind of having a little bit back and forth about getting a little bit impatient, being like, why are you taking so long to respond to me? And signing off with like kind of semi-snarky comments about being like, oh, I wrote this a month ago, I haven't gotten your letter yet. It just pops up, and I just thought that was something that kind of shows like, wow, they're people that we're studying, even if it was 100, 200, 300, however many years ago. And I think that's something that you can kind of like forget when you're just dealing with so much information, so much material. So those kinds of windows into people's lives, I just thought were really interesting and pretty unique to archives, because you just never know when you're going to start reading something that you find interesting. And so, like I said, a big part of this experience was me trying to figure out how to do research in an archive, what works given time constraints, when you take photos, when you request digital scans, when you take like transcribe stuff. And I think sometimes you can kind of go into like a control find or a command find, like search function in your brain, where you're kind of just skimming through everything and you're like, okay, I'm looking for the words like Chinese or immigrant, immigration, China, coolie, something like that. But I really like just meandering sometimes, when you just start reading something random and you're realizing, okay, I'm reading this in like a lot more depth than maybe I need to, but there's something about it that just stood out to you. And maybe it was as a historian, you realize something's interesting, or maybe it's just as a person where you're like, this is personally interesting. But for example, I saw like some paper checks in some of the folders I was looking at. And I was just telling my friends, I was like, wow, the images on these are really interesting. Like the iconography is really interesting. And again, I don't think that's something I would use in my own work or use in this, at least this project, but it's just something that I thought, okay, well, this is, really interesting. And I wouldn't have found this unless I was just, flipping through the pages, kind of meandering through the material. And I think that's something that's, again, pretty unique to doing archival research in person rather than online or anything else where you have an actual search function. You're not just flipping through everything and stopping as you find something that catches your attention. But that was my experience at UNC, and thank you to all the librarians that made it so like smooth and fun and helpful.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your kind words about all of the staff that helped make your trip here so productive and smooth. One person who's not on this particular webinar is Taylor, our research room manager, who's happily out on maternity leave. I think that the system and the smoothness of the system is really her brainchild in the way that she's crafted. I would say, just before we get into questions, one of the things that's really gratifying is to hear you talk about sort of the pleasure of the archive, I guess. One of the things that this fellowship is meant to do is to take away a little bit of that sense of urgency that often presses upon graduate students, especially who have limited funds and limited time and are really extractive and very directed, and allow them just a little more opportunity to look sideways through files to find things that would normally be missed or that were not described, or like you say, that sort of feed into your general sense of what the 19th century texture was. And who knows exactly how you'll use it, but it will undoubtedly inform the way that you recreate, right, this 19th century that you're writing about. So thank you for that. It's nice to hear that that was the case. So I guess right now, let's open it up for questions from people. I would invite you to there aren't a lot of us, so if you'd like to raise your hand and just ask questions of them, that would be fine. I don't need to read them unless you want me to. Well, I guess while we wait for them to ask, I don't see an immediate question. One of the things I was wondering about, Emily, is especially because I was thinking about the Mordecai family before you actually got to the Mordecais. Does confessional space enter into your geography, the role that religion might have played in the conception, or is that tucked into domesticity? I just was curious.
Religious space, that's something that is kind of, I struggle with, like, finding it's interesting because I do have a little bit about how girls use space to engage with religion. There's this one letter I have from another archive about a little mini religious revival that girls started at their boarding school, which is fun. But religion is kind of tucked into that domestic school home space. I don't have like a separate section about it.
Yeah, I rather gathered. I mean, domesticity is
Yeah.
it's a very big space. Yeah, I agree. Other? I do have a question about the term virtual slave. I was just, so that's your term. That's a term that you're creating to talk about the sort of legal, social, economic space occupied by enslaved people that is somewhat out of the standard norm, or am I misunderstanding? Oh, you're on mute.
Unmute. Am I muted? No.
No, now you're not.
Okay. Actually, it's not my term. I borrowed it from the opinions and cases and documents that I read from the antebellum era. So there was great concern about how virtual slaves undermined the community and made enslaved people restive and prone to rebellion. So they were an unsettling element, an unsettling cast of people that in North Carolina particularly, the law prohibited, and that in many cases of virtual slaves, if they were granted their freedom, if it was a freedom suit, of course, there was lots of angst over creating a free Black population and having them stay in the state, and they were required to leave the state in 90 days. So actually, it's a term that Ruffin uses in an opinion. Several other judges, Henderson, those guys use in opinions that in order to be consistent, I just use one term. They use a lot of different terms, like I said, semi-emancipated, quasi-free, but I use that one term just to be consistent. And I will define that term in the introduction so that it's clear.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating term because it resonates so contemporary.
Yes, right.
It was interesting.
Except that it really is ancient.
Yeah, no, well, I don't know if one of the first things that happened to me in an archive way long time ago was when I was reading these old ledgers, and I just came across the word ditto, and I didn't realize that it was Latin and that it was something that was very old. It just seemed to me to be something very modern. So yeah, you can be surprised like that. Samuel, I was wondering, I remember a few years ago, well, it's probably more than that, I was reading a New York Times article on food, and it was food in Mississippi, and particularly Chinese food and adaptations of things like collards for green. And I was wondering if there were oral histories that exist with families of descendants of Chinese laborers that would lend insights into what it was like to come here as immigrants. I don't know that they exist, but it made me wonder.
No, I don't know if they exist either, but I was also wondering about that as well. And I was actually just trying to figure out like where could I find this, and how can I get funding to go around the South and try to find restaurants and also talk to people while I'm eating at those restaurants. But when I was on the plane, because I went to Louisiana after UNC, and when I was leaving Louisiana, the person next to me was telling me about all these Chinese restaurants in the Baton Rouge area, New Orleans area, and that's got me thinking about what you just mentioned. Like, oh, can I try to find some kind of food history or oral history of descendants? That's actually what I'm hoping to do next, as like a next step.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. One of the things, if you do that, the Southern Oral History Program is housed on our campus, and they have an awful lot of sort of the legal and intellectual apparatus that you need to conduct oral histories that sort of have legs, right? That have the appropriate permissions to deposit them and to use them. They're wonderful people that I could definitely put you in touch with. And I don't think, I'm not searching it, but I'm sort of searching it in my head. I don't know that I've seen a series. These are thousands of interviews divided into particular series. I don't know that I've seen Asian communities, but I don't know that I've seen ethnic Chinese communities as a part of that, at least as a focused series. So that could be something interesting to them. And they have a system that actually allows materials to be streamed online. So it's deeply accessible. So if this was also something that would be really deeply meaningful to descendants of the communities, it's a way of maintaining them and providing access that's nicer than giving everybody copies of tapes that end up in a closet and are unreadable when we all get like, who has a tape recorder anymore? I don't. Those sorts of things. Well, I mean, not that it would be a tape.
Great. I have to look them up.
Yeah, if you can't find them, send me a note. I'd be happy to put you in touch. Are there any other questions that people have in the audience, or did you all, this is probably the first opportunity because I'm thinking that mostly you weren't here at the same time, if my memory is correct. So you probably hadn't met each other, but do you have questions for each other about the work that you're doing?
I thought it was really interesting. I remember Catherine and I were overlapped a bit.
Oh, good.
We did.
Yeah, I remember talking. I thought I really loved the bit you were talking about with the poetry. It reminded me of, David Drake, who's been in the news a lot. Um, his pottery is going for like insane prices right now. But that I thought that was really cool. And but Samuel, I thought, that's a history that I really don't know much about, the history of Chinese laborers in, the Reconstruction South. So I thought that was really cool, and I'm interested to learn more as your research progresses.
Yeah, Emily, his enslaver actually let him come to UNC and stand on the corner and write poetry and sell his poetry to UNC students. And he would do love poems and, things that they could give to their girlfriend. It's really amazing. And Sam, I thought, you might look at some legal cases about Chinese indenture and, contracts, that kind of thing. I wasn't focused on that area, but Family Search has all the original documents of 19th century cases. And I don't know, might be something to look at. The opinions, especially if they do get to a Supreme Court, a state Supreme Court, the opinions are pretty illuminating.
I would have to look at them. Yeah, I mean, I really just enjoyed listening to both of you talk about your projects and both because of like the actual content sounds really interesting, and also just to kind of hear and like, oh, that's how they're like structuring and thinking about their chapters and everything. And that was, to me, was just like, wow, that's interesting to see.
Well, I don't see any other questions. I don't want to keep you all. I really enjoyed hearing what you've done. One of the things I was thinking about for Emily is there's kind of an after history with Cornelia Phillips Spencer. There was an award named after her, and there was a big kerfuffle here on campus relatively recently. So look up the Bell Award, and there's a set of private papers. John Kenyon, Kenyon Chapman, is a historian, but he was also a campus activist. And I think there's some material in there associated with Cornelia Phillips Spencer, and some of it may be digitized. And it's just, I before you write a lot about her, I just want to make sure that you have the latest information on her.
Okay. All I have right now is that like column in her bookmark, really. So
yeah, it'd be good just to dot some I's and cross some T's. So begin with that, and then know that I'm here to help you sort of figure that, push you into some other directions. Okay. It's interesting when they grow up.
That's the thing. Like I approach these girls when they're very like small and like, oh, just and then they grow up and it's like, oh no.
Well, there's the Alfred Waddell papers, Waddell. There is a Rebecca Cameron writing him, I don't know if it's your Rebecca Cameron. I think it might be, but writes him basically about Wilmington before the Wilmington massacre occurs, about the need for violence and the need to get your shotguns. But it might be worth looking at just to sort of put a bow on the sort of endpoint. Well, again, I really enjoyed speaking with you all. It's just so gratifying to hear what you've done, and it's just so creative and so interesting. So there'll be other ones, and you're more than welcome to come and listen to others. And I hope to see you back, at least in this research room or another research room in the future. So take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
You too.